Hey everyone, and welcome to the Employee Engagement Webcast, the December edition. I am thrilled that you are here. I'm so glad you joined me. We're going to have a terrific conversation today, and I suspect you're going to leave here inspired and informed and with some really interesting insights to take back to your work. Before we get into this, first, for those of you that maybe aren't as familiar with who I am, my name is Jason Lortz, and I am your host for this Employee Engagement Webcast. When I'm not webcasting, I am a speaker, an author, and consultant in the field of employee engagement. I have a deep passion for helping organizations create more human work experiences for their employees so that their employees can win and the organization can win. And this format, this webcast, is really my effort to try to highlight both people and stories that we can all be inspired from and learn from those who have sort of maybe gone ahead of us, have done some work and created some really interesting experience for the employees that they lead and care for and have responsibility for designing those experiences. So I'm hoping that everyone. I had to move to a headset. I was suffering from some technical challenges, but I hope that everybody can hear me. So before we get into this conversation today, I want to thank our sponsor, Shindig. And Shindig is the rather than sort of tell you about them, you're experiencing Shindig. Shindig is the platform that we are using today to host the webcast. And Shindig, basically the goal that I understand they set forth to do was to create a platform where you could create the feeling of an in-person meeting, but do it online so that you can start to sort of bring the intimacy and connection of an in-person meeting to either a experience like this or maybe an internal meeting. There's a lot of really cool features within this platform. We're only going to scratch the surface of a few today, but stuff we're not going to use today are things like you can grab another attendee and step into a private room where you can have a discussion that others can't hear. You can chat with one another in your rooms or at your tables, the sort of the groups that you've joined as you came in. A lot of great features, but the important ones for today are how you will interact with us, because in a minute or so here, I'm going to introduce Chris and we're going to jump into our conversation. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, but then we're going to open the floor for you to ask questions and to comment and have a conversation with us. And if there are two ways you can do this. If you have turned on your webcam and you would like to ask your question in person, face to face, you can raise your hand. There's a little hand at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, or if you hover over it, it says raise hand. If you click on it, it will raise your hand. I can see that. I will pull you up on stage and you can ask your question. If you accidentally raise your hand, you'll see the hand turn dark. You can click it and it'll lower your hand again. If you don't want your face to be up on the screen, you can ask a question by using the little question bubble at the bottom. If you put a question in there, I will see that. When we get to the question and answer period, I'll click on it, pull it up, read it, and then Chris or I can tackle that question. So I think that's it for housekeeping. Let's get into this because I am really, really excited to introduce my guest today. My guest is a longtime friend of mine, and he's someone who inspires me through his work all the time. I'm going to bring him up as I'm doing his introduction. Chris Adler is the Director of Social Media and Community Engagement at Chili's Restaurants. Chili's, I'm assuming most of you know. If you are in the U.S. and you don't know of Chili's, chances are you've been in a cave or you never watched television. I know I, for one, am a longtime sort of fan. I have the jingle burned into my brain. I can sing it for you. I might sing it for you at some point today. But you know of Chili's. Chili's is everywhere. And Chris is going to take us inside of some of how Chili's has created a really cool workplace. And part of the reason that I've been inspired by the Chili's story and the work that Chris and team have done is that I think engagement and creating an engaging work experience is hard no matter where you are, no matter what kind of business you're in. But I think in the restaurant, it's unusually challenging. And so it'd be interesting to talk about that. And Chili's has done some great things. I mean, just a little bit of the kudos. 2015, Chili's was named by Fortune magazine as the number 11 best place to work for millennials in the U.S. That is astonishing and amazing work. 2016 named the Employee Engagement Company of the Year for the North American Employee Engagement Awards, among lots of other accolades. Great restaurant, great place to work, and Chris is a great guy. So, Chris, let's start by, I want to get into more of your bio here in a second, but number one, welcome, I should say. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
And number two, tell us what a director of social media and community engagement does at Chili's, and then I want to get into some more of your background. But what do you do today?
Yeah, so we lead all of our national platforms for certainly Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Every now and again, we play with Snapchat. We've got some content up on Tumblr as well. But that's kind of the primary function for me. But this community engagement bucket is really special and really important to me because what we get to do is get involved with how this company is fostering a sense of meaning in the work that we do, certainly meaning in our communities and what we're doing to give back. So it's a dual role. Part of the expectation for me is to ensure that we are telling that story. And so it was an opportunity for me about a year ago to take on social media for the brand and essentially foster that sense of brand love in what we're doing every day.
So you now live kind of on at least what I would describe kind of the marketing side of the world, sort of looking out customers and engaging the external community. But for 10 years prior to that, you were on the inside side of the world, the HR side of the house. You had some pretty cool titles like Director of Workplace Community and Senior Manager of Workplace Community and People Branding. Some really juicy stuff in there. So could you take us through maybe a little bit, as if I remember, you came to Chili's initially in training or instructional design or that kind of background, and then you moved into these broader roles. Talk about what was your role when you were leading workplace community and people branding? Like what was that role?
So I'll try to give the Reader's Digest version of it. It's been a long journey, and you're right. I mean, I think what's cool about the workplace these days is there's so much opportunity, and yet I think companies that are doing it really well are finding people that have certain strengths and aiming them in that direction. And I've had support and some people that have really allowed me to kind of explore how I can impact the company. So long story short, you're right. I came here 11 years ago, working for Romano's Macaroni Grill, which is at the time was a Brinker international brand. Chili's and Maggiano's are still Brinker brands. I was purely dedicated to Romano's Macaroni Grill, learning and development, and really got into strategy at that point in time and trying to influence what we were doing, which at that time was a very paper-based system, thick manuals that kind of told you in a lot of text how to do things. But we moved the needle there. Eventually, I got into the Brinker organization as more of a shared services function. My role there evolved into something that I was really passionate about, which was culture. And what are companies doing to foster this really kind of unique time period in life and society where people are expecting a little bit more out of their companies than just a paycheck. And I was able to kind of influence some of the direction we were going with that through my role in PeopleWorks. Eventually, it turned into talent marketing and employment branding and really telling that Chili's story, primarily through social media and our chilisjobs.com website. And then, like I said, about a year ago, the ask of me was, can you bring what you've done with Chili's Jobs to the Chili's brand, which at that time, social was really purely focused on selling burgers, ribs, and fajitas. It wasn't necessarily about telling much of a story or truly really engaging with people that are our fans and followers. So that's kind of my journey.
Got it. So, one of the things that I've always found, I mean, I think is really interesting about your journey is that somewhere along the line you became really interested in brand, and you started studying that. And I know that from conversations that brand is a really big part of your work and what you think about it and how you've shaped it. You've mentioned it already a couple times. Where did you, like, at what point did that happen? Like, when did you become aware of like what brand was and the impact it was, and how do you think about that? Like, how did that impact or change maybe the trajectory of your work in HR?
Well, I have been somewhat of a chameleon in the sense that I actually went to school for marketing. So I have a marketing degree. But what I was more passionate about, especially kind of coming up through the years, I used to actually work for Blockbuster. So I always giggle a little bit, and I'm sure people listening today are kind of laughing a little bit about working for a company that doesn't even really exist anymore. I think there's like 2 locations that are franchises. One of them I think is in Alaska, but it's kind of a fascinating journey of brand and really not only in terms of business strategy, but in terms of a consumer's willingness to kind of ride through the bumps with a company and still be either loyal or not. So my history or my education is really marketing, but I was particularly passionate about the people side of the business, and am always comfortable talking to folks, and storytelling really is kind of my passion. And so social, whether it be on the people side of the business or the brand side of the business, allows me to do that and kind of be the voice of the brand.
So what did that like? Let's dive into. I mean, a lot of times we hear kind of the high level talk about brand and how brand has come into HR, or sort of the connection between that. Talk about let's actually do some get into some examples. So can you give me a story of how did you bring sort of brand into the HR workplace community? What did that look like? I know that I remember you telling me several stories, but what would be one that jumps out for you that you're proud of?
I mean, I think, back in the day, this was probably, 7 years ago, one of the things that kind of in the early days of the idea of internal branding and internal communication having some sort of influence over how people felt emotionally connected to their company, I had the pretty distinct pleasure to work on essentially creating an internal brand from the ground up. We had been working on particularly like the first project that really was kind of the inception point of all of this was an employee handbook, which I know you and I have talked about kind of the dreaded employee handbook for years. We also used to get involved in benefits documentation. That HIPAA stuff is not exactly the most engaging stuff when you get it in the mail from your company. And so we talked a whole lot about how are we talking to people that work here, and is it matching this culture that we talk about so much? Our former CEO Doug Brooks kind of was the very model of work hard, play hard, and it was interesting that the employee handbook at the time was written by the legal department. It was the tiniest font you could ever imagine, 6-point font, and really was focused on lecturing people essentially. And it was an opportunity to overhaul that and insert culture back into materials and communication that was intended to connect people to what they do every day. And so we did that for years. It eventually turned into an internal online portal for team members. It turned into something that is still very much intact and functioning today to kind of communicate that sense. Now I think what's happening is you get this, at least in our industry, and I'm sure in many of the industries that people are listening in today, the economy is back in a place where turnover has gone up, retention has gone down. You've got a lot of people kind of cycling through very quickly. So then the question becomes, how do you make it a little bit more kind of direct and to the point and compact, and still have this sense of emotion associated with why people work there.
So give me an example, like give me an example of what it was versus what it like, what was the, what, give me, like, what does that look like? What did the before and after sound like?
I mean, the best way to describe it is, we spoke to people like we do in the hallways. It was a voice exercise, really. The very kind of functional form factor part of it was, it was all, everything we were doing was essentially in Microsoft Word, kind of, written by experts that weren't necessarily concerned about trying to convey any sense of story or meaning or purpose behind what they were doing. It was just simply, here's what you do, here's what you don't do. It turned into something that was much more kind of a self-reflection of, this is who we are, and if this is you too, you're going to have a good time here and you're going to be very successful here. And I think that's been the big differentiator. I know on Chili's Jobs social platforms, we've particularly seen that people want to be seen. Do you value me for more than just a body in this building? I think we all feel that is, or do we have a sense of value? Do our bosses care about what we're doing every day? Does leadership care about what we're doing every day? Is this more than just a paycheck to me? And we've been able to kind of see what that means to people. Our leadership team, particularly our president, Kelly Belade, our chief operations officer, Doug Cummings, they are super active, as an example, on Twitter. And they connect with people day in and day out. And when they're in restaurants, and doing visits, they're telling the story. They're telling the story of what we're all about and why it matters. People have that sense of connection personally and in person, but then it goes online and they say, wow, I can't believe you remember me, or I can't believe, you shared that picture of us online, or whatever. I think people are just looking to, like, do you see me? And I think that's not only in the workplace, I think it's outside of the workplace as well, but we've really tried to kind of generate that sense of, we see you. One of the worst things I think that can destroy a culture is an us versus them mentality. And the moments where I cringe the most is when I go into a restaurant and somebody says, well, corporate made the decision to do this. Because that just kind of speaks to the fact that they feel disenfranchised and disconnected from the work that they're doing every day. So I think that's the big difference in terms of, like, before and after. There's a sense of, you see me, you get me.
Got it. So one of the things that I'm curious about, and I think this is one that we wrestle, or a lot of people wrestle with this, is you've used the term internal brand, culture. There's external brand. Like, what's the difference between, like, is internal, what's the difference between internal brand and culture, and how is internal brand and external brand, like, how do those all tie together?
That literally defines what I'm doing day in and day out right now. That to me is the $54,000 question. What we have seen in our journey with this is that these worlds were kind of separate and distinct. It was, the brand message was, in the early days of my marketing education, it was all about the 4 P's of marketing. It was, product, price, placement, and promotion. And yet I have really seen the power of kind of shifting that to the 4 C's of content and communication and connection. People feeling a sense of, like, this is more than just selling burgers, ribs, and fajitas. There's more meaning to it. I think the biggest thing we're learning is that there really is this kind of, at least in the 4 or 5 years that I've been studying employment branding, and some that are doing it the best, there's this big question of, is what you're doing marketing, or is what you're doing people and culture, and should it sit in HR or should it sit in marketing? And I'm kind of a unique guinea pig, I think, because I'm a people guy that is now leading what we're doing from a brand voice standpoint on the marketing side. And so that's been a real gift and a real joy. It to me, it's not about organizational structure. It's not necessarily about who sits where and who does what. It's purely, are we saying the same things? And in the early days of this kind of, as I joined the marketing team about a year ago, we got into a room. We literally took everything from digital content to social content to email to website to internal communication, the employee handbook, all of that stuff, and put it around a room. And it was a little daunting. It was a little overwhelming because what we found was we are not consistently conveying the same sort of personality, the same brand voice. And what it kind of hinted to us is, first of all, we need clarity. We need clarity for the people that work here. We need clarity for our consumers. But we also found very quickly that these were functions working in silos, and they were not kind of aligned and working together to communicate the same message and the same brand values. So that has been the big journey this past year, frankly, and we're still on it. We're not perfect at it, but I think the first step along that way was we made a decision and kind of consciously pushed back on the idea that social doesn't need to be a channel for product, price, promotion, and place. And so we've distanced ourselves from that idea with the intent of bringing back some of the culture and the personality of this brand that has been here for 42 years. So it's been a blessing. It's not easy. That whole idea of one brand, one voice is not easy because, again, I think these two functions kind of sit in different worlds in most organizations.
So I had a question come in from Doug that in our audience, and he was asking that when you went through this internal brand development, the people brand development, what kind of impact were you able to measure or isolate? Like, where did you see, were you able to quantify as you were doing that work that there was some impact, whether it be, what metrics were you looking at to try, or what were you trying to move?
I think one of the biggest things we've seen is, not to share too much context, but the restaurant industry has become, there's competition everywhere you look. I mean, when you consider, the Whole Foods of the world that are now kind of encroaching on this idea of, we're going to prepare a meal for you and you can just literally walk in and pick it up and take it home and heat it up and you're good to go. That impact on competition, new segments in this market, the incredible kind of rush of fast casual brands that have taken the table service element out of the equation. There's so many of them. Panera has done it amazingly. Chipotle, of course, has done it well. And there's so many of them. So beyond just the way people even eat now. So one of the fascinating things we're seeing is that people are associating kind of a snack with a meal. So this whole idea of if there's any Starbucks fans in the audience, you walk into Starbucks, you see that kind of counter display. There's always like the smallest little package of crackers and cheese and almonds and whatever, and it's kind of a take and go sort of thing. That has actually started to replace meals for people. So there's kind of this era of smaller meals. Even people associate a granola bar with a meal. So it's starting to replace the idea of having a full breakfast. That said, the impact that we've seen for us is, do you believe in this company strategy? Do you believe in the leadership of this organization? And do you believe that we're on the right path? What we did see when we went down that journey, specifically relative to brand, was two things. Number one, are people aware of the Chili's brand in today's context rather than 40 years ago? So we had a lot of people telling us, oh yeah, I remember my mom and dad taking me to Chili's back in the day, but I haven't been since I was a kid. Obviously, the demographic shifts that have happened are really kind of fascinating to watch, not only from a consumer standpoint and a guest standpoint, but from what it's done to our employees as well, and what that means to us in terms of who we're bringing into this company hiring wise. But two big metrics we saw is awareness of Chili's in today's context. Number two, we have a metric we track: belief in brand direction and belief in leadership. Those have not only they've accelerated in terms of kind of the metric that we watch in our engagement results. So I think that's the most important thing, because obviously with so much kind of competitive pressure and business strategy at play, people have to believe that it's the right thing to do.
Did that connect back then to things like customer satisfaction improvements, or like were you able to correlate those when those numbers move? Does it move things like that, or unit sales, or employee, even associate retention?
Yeah. So, the hard part is to make that leap back to retention and turnover, because what we're feeling or experiencing is that there was definitely this period of time, probably about a year ago, where we started to see, a year and a half ago, where we started to see turnover go up. I think that was really much more a function of economy and unemployment rate and people having more opportunities available to them. For us, that has now started to go back down again and kind of taper off. For a long time, we had best-in-class turnover results, and it got a little more difficult the past couple of years, just based on just pressures of people having more opportunity than ever in a while, at least, certainly since the recession. So, but yeah, we can make that track back to specifically intent to return. Do people have a good experience, and do they intend to come back? One thing you and I have always talked about for years is that the net is, it's still a matter of what kind of leadership and management do I have in that restaurant or in that business unit, with that kind of statement that people always say, I'm going to quit my manager, I'm not necessarily quitting my company. And so we still see that. I don't want to give the wrong impression that we don't have our difficult days as well. But sometimes you have to make those difficult decisions to kind of say, these people are not aligned to our culture and the belief in what we're doing. And they're not delivering results. So those are hard conversations, obviously, but we have seen that the best performers are the ones that are able to kind of transfer that belief in what the company is doing to their team.
Got it. So I want to change. I want to change direction just a little bit, because one of the things that I think is so interesting, and one of the things that you've done that I admire and I think is unique in particular, is how you leveraged social media, like external social media, in the engagement of your workplace community. There's still a lot of organizations and a lot of HR teams that are struggling with, what do we do with social media and all these what if scenarios, and yet you've been out there. So can you talk a little bit about how that, what that looks like? How does Chili's, or how has Chili's used social media to engage employees? And I'm not talking internal, but external, Twitter and Facebook or whatever. What does that look like? And what results have you seen? So tell us a little bit about how that looks.
Yeah, so the journey for us started many years ago, where we did a blind study where we were looking for an understanding of perception, purely brand perception, as it relates to career and growth opportunities and just job search. So we did a blind study. We interviewed people from some of our competitors that didn't know that it was Chili's asking the questions, obviously. And we would ask, would you consider leaving where you're at now if a good opportunity presented itself? And people said, absolutely, I would certainly consider it. And we kind of rattled off why that might be. What would you leave for? It was always about, money, obviously. but growth and development, leadership opportunities, growth of a company. So is a company growing? It was really, really interesting when we kind of probed into that a little bit further and started asking, would you leave for, let's say, Chili's? And every last one of the people we talked to said no. So, after the punch in the gut of, oh God, like, what is that telling us? There's something broken there. We dug in a little deeper and really tried to, and really figured out that the perception was so sideways because we were communicating a Brinker story. We were communicating more of a parent company story of, look at all these brands you can work for, rather than really telling the specific chili story. The company had invested hundreds of millions of dollars back into our restaurants, into updating our kitchen technology, into updating our computer systems and communication platforms, into just purely remodels of our building, the look and feel. And again, those folks that had kind of grown up with Chili's as kids, dining out with us, didn't make that journey with us to be more of this kind of today's Chili's. So ultimately, that's really what we were setting out to do. What was a byproduct of that we loved, of course, was our own team members kind of came along with us on the ride. And they were incredibly passionate in telling that story and sharing that story. To answer your question, the biggest thing we had to do was make sure we had established who was doing what. Because again, at the time, things were very different in the sense that the marketing team was like, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing out there creating your own social handles? And now I live in that world, and I get it. I get that there's a risk associated with it. So part of what we had to do was prove out, number one, the business case for doing it, which has paid for itself time and time again. The second thing was we had to build the belief that we could do it internally. So for anybody watching, that's a big question, because it does mean resourcing. It does mean once you kind of turn the faucets, you're not, I wouldn't recommend suddenly turning it off. So what we knew was this was a long-term journey. This was not just a sprint. And we were going to be there for a while. And then the last thing we had to do was really establish kind of processes and systems, because what that meant was my team was going to have to take on the responsibility of making sure we were addressing team members that weren't behaving the way we would expect them to, specifically on social, in terms of what information they were sharing or what content they were putting out there. So the journey was worth it, though, no question about it. It naturally creates some anxiety with leadership, of course.
So how did you, that last one you kind of dropped in as if it was just oh yeah, we also had to deal with this. But I think that's where most organizations get hung up is what happens when an employee or a customer goes rogue on our Twitter platform and starts, going nuclear? Like, what do we do? I'm curious, when you were putting that together, what was the discussion around that? What was the guidelines? Like, did you give some thought, like when something does happen, how are we going to respond, or what guidelines? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, really, we were kind of told that that there was support for going down this journey, and yet that we couldn't withstand the risk of not having documented processes in place. And so that was really kind of in the very, very early days. That was step number one, establish guidelines were not really a policy per se, but just what are the guardrails, what's okay and not okay. We see it in the restaurant industry a lot that servers will take a photo of a guest's receipt, and they're either angry that they didn't get tipped at all, or there maybe is a note written by the guest to the server. We said basically outright, that is an example of something that's just flat out unacceptable, and we'll hold you accountable for it. So I think you do have to kind of, for your industry and for your business, determine what those guardrails are and then communicate them, which we did. And then last but not least, I would say you've got to kind of stick with it. There has to be, again, a system in place to have some intervention. We focused primarily on our senior leadership or our field leadership at the time, getting area directors involved and our VPs in the field involved, encouraging them to let this and allow this to happen. And then when and if we had a situation that was not what we wanted, obviously, we had to intervene. And so, again, there had to be a system on this side as well, to then contact those field operators and say, we need your help to go address this. And we've had everything from, just a conversation of, hey, you're not creating the right beliefs, to that's just flat out unacceptable, and we can't have you working here.
And maybe this is just there's a great question teed up I want to throw at you, but one follow up on that is, how do you know when it's appropriate, particularly with an employee, to engage the conversation online? So if it's a Twitter or a Facebook, how do you know when to engage it there, and when it's like behind the scenes, let's handle this in house? Like, how do you make that determination?
Yeah, there's first of all, there's again, there's a laundry list. I won't go through it all today, but stuff like, slander and threats,
Right.
and violence and things of that nature. Just we very quickly kind of pursue that and correct that. I think what's interesting is when people are frankly just kind of so fired up and excited to share something, and they don't think, what perception are you creating? As an example, we've actually had moments where people have said, geez, are they even working in that restaurant? Because it looks like they're having a whole lot of fun. Again, that's not a bad thing necessarily, but we also don't want to create the belief that we're not taking care of our guests. So it has really been an interesting journey, but those are very simply coaching moments is what we refer to them as, and frankly, kind of educating people on, do you know kind of the perception that it could have happened because of that. The other thing we just essentially coach on is, don't reveal company results. Don't be reporting, percentages of sales and, oh my God, we opened a new restaurant and we crushed it on the first day of sales or whatever. Those are just conversations. That's not something that we're going to terminate anybody over.
Got it. So I want to go to a question from Nicole and team. And the question is, they said, you talk about brand voice. How would you describe the voice of Chili's, number one, and how would one begin to define their own brand voice?
My favorite question of the day. So the voice of Chili's has really particularly evolved because, and we are literally in the process of kind of internally addressing this and documenting what we think that is. The advantage for us from a social perspective is we've been able to kind of run out the gate with what we think is a better defined brand voice. The answer to the question is going to be different for everybody, but what I will say is, particularly the Chili's brand voice is, we knew that we, over the years, grew so fast, and we essentially communicated more about kind of products and services, which again was kind of old school marketing idea. And in that kind of vast expansion, we started to take ourselves and our business really, really seriously. And we started to kind of, oh, I hope this doesn't make anybody mad. And when you come from that place, you immediately start to withhold and essentially communicate a different brand perception. What we've started to say is, number one, this is a very self-aware brand. We get it when we make a mistake, and we're going to be honest for it. But we come from a place of we talk a lot about, look, glass half full, life is good. So we're not going to, that some of these, we've obviously all seen kind of some brands that are really having a heck of a lot of fun. going after their competitors. That's really not a space that we're necessarily going to play in. Do we interact with other brands in social? Absolutely. But we're not necessarily coming from a place of, you suck, we're better. Because, again, there's room for everybody here. We're kind of saying, let's do what we do best and not worry about everybody else, which has more recently really been a great internal conversation about what we do go after and what we don't. One of our competitors this month put out there a drink special that obviously generated a lot of interest. And for a hot second, there was a conversation about, do we go do something similar? And we said, wait a minute, like that's not who we are. Let them be them. Let's be us. And so as a result, we already had planned to dedicate the entire month of December to helping kids with cancer, and our focus on St. Jude. Not only did we maintain that, we essentially upped the ante even more. So there's a lot of kind of more specifics associated with our brand voice, but when all is said and done, it's really about be true to who you are. And last but not least, I'll say we had to put some humor back into it. When you think about, this is a brand that started in a renovated post office, in Greenville and Meadow and Dallas. We didn't take ourselves so seriously then, and we started to take ourselves too seriously. We had to put some humor back into it and just have a little fun.
So if you just quickly to answer the second, or to challenge you on the second part of Nicole's question, if you had, one bit of advice, like where would you say, if they're sitting there talking about, man, we need to get clear on our brand voice, what's the first step? What would you tell them to do first?
So first of all, take some risks. You have to have some brand champions inside the building, and you got to go find them. We interviewed about 15 people that have all walks of life and have served all kinds of roles and functions within this company, and we talked to them about kind of their journey. We also want to understand what's the perception of somebody coming in the door now versus somebody that joined the company, 25 years ago. That was really, really fascinating and very eye-opening. We essentially published a set of 10 insights that came out of those conversations. But we were challenged. Kelly certainly challenged us to keep it small. One of the things I think that's really interesting specifically about brand voice and personality is everybody has an opinion, but not everybody's right. And so then the question becomes, all right, again, let's test this out a little bit. Is that who we think we are or not? And it's not, what it can't be is, let's vote. It can't be, the biggest voice in the room wins. It has to be something that everybody says with a sense of confidence. They go, yeah, that's us, like that. And you can kind of, you put it up on the screen or on the wall or whatever, and you go, I don't know if that's us. So it is a little bit of trial and error. But what I will say is talk to people, understand what emotional association they have with the brand, but don't let people vote on determining what they think the brand is. It's got to be something that's definitive, and sometimes it means people are going to end up saying, you know what, that's not me, and that's okay, but that is the brand.
Sure, and I'll interpret that as being, it needs to be authentic.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the word that we talk about a lot. It needs to be authentic to who you actually are and what you are about and how you show up every day.
And take a little bit of a journey backwards. I think history is less important than heritage. There's a difference between those two. History is a set of events or moments in time, things that you can kind of recall back on a calendar. Heritage is something very, very different. There's an emotional association with what that
Sure.
means. And really, I think the question becomes, what do you want to leave behind? We've gone through an exercise here recently also where we had to say, hey, we got to a point where it works. So station about authenticity is, it's like, some people are not going to go with us moving forward. We got to be okay with that.
Sure. Got it. I'm going to bring up, actually have a video chat. Mike wants to share a question that was bouncing around in the chat. So I'm bringing Mike up to share a question with you, Chris. Mike, take it away.
Hey, gentlemen. So this question popped up in the chat here that you can't see. This is from Nadine. Nadine says, what tools does Chili's have in place to empower their employees to share on social? And what tools do they have in place to monitor these posts?
So from a monitoring standpoint, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. From a monitoring standpoint, I'll say there's a pretty robust set of listening tools where we're kind of always watching and listening. We've also got some partners of ours that we have hired to kind of be on the lookout, especially during times of day where maybe it's later at night or on the weekends. Just another set of eyes and ears. So on the listening side, I would say we feel very confident we've got a robust set of tools and applications that kind of help us listen to that big fire hose of stuff coming in. There's about anywhere from 50,000 to 80,000 mentions of our brand every week. A vast majority of those are where people are talking about us, but they're not necessarily engaging with us. They're not tagging us. They're not kind of talking to us per se. They're talking about us. We listen to that very intently. In terms of tools, so there's multiple. There is kind of a first day culture immersion that's happening where we want to convey that sense of heritage and who we are and what we value and what we care about more than just this is how you go greet a table. It's really important for us, and we've kind of flipped the script on that as well, where we're putting a little bit more invested time up front to tell that story. The other thing I would say is there's a set of kind of online tools available to team members. There's also, paper-based stuff like the employee handbook, which we talked about before. All of that stuff now, roughly, gosh, I guess it's been maybe 3 years now, very much upfront addresses that we want you talking on social, which was a culture shift for sure. But now the systems and processes are in place to communicate up front and let people participate. And then we do a ton of listening on the brand side for both team member related stuff and guest related stuff.
Got it. Well, we are almost at the end. One last question for you, Chris, and then I will let you go. This is a question I like to ask of everybody, is what is the one thing from your experience that you think most people get wrong about employee engagement, and what should they be doing instead?
You probably know what I'm going to say. It's become a number. It's become a metric. It's become something we report on. It's something that has turned into this is a portion of your bonus program, or this is it's rather than a conversation. And I think that's the one thing that is really needing to evolve, is that you can ask questions all day about what people think or feel about your company or their boss or whatever, and when all is said and done, that stuff doesn't matter a hill of beans unless somebody's having a conversation, and frankly, a transparent conversation, to be able to say that there's some things we're doing great at, there's some things we're not doing great at. I think what ends up happening is a lot of that stuff gets kind of like shoved under a rug, and it turns into a report. Here's the results. Here's how we did, rather than a two-way dialogue, a conversation about what does this mean. When it's numbers on a piece of paper, it's really, really hard to understand and interpret. It turns into like, I wonder who said that. I wonder who scored us low on that. Rather than, gee, I wonder why people are saying that. It doesn't matter who said it. Don't go on a hunt to try and figure it out and like decipher, like, oh gosh, that must mean there's somebody that's having a bad experience. We got to go find who they are. That's not what it's about. I think it's more a question of, what's the conversation look like to kind of ensure that those people that are having rough experiences in the workplace feel like somebody's listening, somebody values what I have to say, rather than it being a report card.
That's awesome. Well said. Chris, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all this. I feel like we could probably do another couple hours worth of content if we had the time, but we need to let everybody get back to work. And probably you need to get back to work, and I need to get back to work. So thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. As always, it was delightful. For everyone, thank you for joining this month. I hope that you found a nugget. If you loved something about this, or there was something that you think we can do better, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at jason@jasonlortzen.com. Always love feedback. And I look forward to seeing you all in the new year. Have a very happy holidays. And I'm going to bring up, as we end, a special offer from our friends at Shindig. If you're curious about the tool, they have a special offer to share with you as you think about the holidays. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time.